My first tip is to plan sequences, not lessons.
Ooh, I like it. Right, tell me more about this.
Okay, so I probably started doing some kind of version of this maybe about 7 or 8 years ago now, and it absolutely revolutionised the way I thought about teaching, because it changed the focus. And for me, before, my focus around what I did was governed by the time frame that I had, and in some schools it would be 50 minutes, and in some schools it would be an hour. And my thought would be, I have a fixed amount of time. What are we going to do in that time? What do I want to cover in that time? And the time was kind of the main driver of everything else. It was kind of the overarching constraint. So when I changed to doing this process, it kind of flips it on its head, because what I do now is I think, I need to teach certain things, certain ideas, certain concepts. I want my pupils to have certain types of practice. I want them to become fluent in things. I want them to be exposed to thinking in different ways about lots of things to do with maths. And now I structure what I do by thinking about that first. And I essentially, for a kind of a unit of learning, I have one massive long flip chart or PowerPoint, and I just go through it. But I mean, that sounds like I'm kind of slavishly following it. That's not the case. What it means is I know key things that I want to do at certain times, and if those things happen to go across the kind of now what I see as an artificial boundary of one lesson to the next, then fine. So I have no problem in something kind of being finished in the middle of a lesson and then we pick it up the next lesson, because it's more important to me that pupils are exposed to certain activities, certain tasks, certain ways of thinking, certain lines of questioning, and the time frames that we have for our lessons are they just have to kind of be subservient to that, really. Got it.
Right. The questions begin here, Gemma, because I've loads to ask you about this. So, practically speaking, you're talking a big old PowerPoint here. So just give us a sense, for like a 2-week unit of work or something, how many slides might we be talking here?
Probably about 70 to 80.
Whoa. And what kind of things are on there? Like examples you're going to ask? Is everything on there?
Well, okay, so yeah, this part. Let me go back a little bit. This is partly because what I'm doing at the moment is I'm making resources that lots of teachers can use of varying levels of experience. So yes. Some teachers who are non-specialists teaching maths will use these. Some of them are very, very experienced. So I'm trying to put all sorts in there, so that teachers can or cannot, or can choose to use or not use things depending on how confident they feel with the material. So when I'm saying 70 or 80 slides, this includes loads of diagnostic questions at certain points and hinge questions and all that kind of thing. It includes ways of explaining things. It includes example problem pairs. It also includes the activities that I want the pupils to do in case the teachers don't have the capacity to do lots of printing. So it's basically everything across 2 weeks across 70 or 80 slides.
Nice. And what tends to be the first slide that you write there? What's the first thing that you put down?
That's a very good question. I think that depends on the content. So I wrote one recently for the very start of Year 7, which is a unit on place value, and we started with a bit of the history of number and the history of the number system and how we write and that kind of thing. Whereas a recent one I've done on the introduction to algebra, what did that begin with? I've only just finished writing it. That began with a kind of I've completely forgotten now. I'm not even going to try and pretend to answer that.
Well, what I'm interested in...
But it might be... I remember what it started with. It started with a discussion question, which was prompting the pupils to think about... basically, I had a set of examples of the form, like 2 times 3 plus 8 times 3, and 2 times 6 plus 8 times 6, where it was all 2 lots of a number plus 8 lots of a number. And I wanted them to discuss these and say what they all had in common, looking at the fact that they all represented 10 lots of a number, and then we kind of go into drawing that as an area model, and then thinking about 2n plus 8n is 10n and all those kinds of things. So it started with a discussion question.
And is the first thing that so that's obviously how your sequence of lessons would start. So is that the first thing you write as well? When you're putting together this PowerPoint, do you start your writing where your lessons would start? Or do you have like an end question in mind that you want the kids to get to, and perhaps that's the first thing you bang down in your PowerPoint, if that makes sense?
These days, I start by thinking about the kind of the broad route I want to take through what we're trying to learn first. So let me stick with this algebra one, for instance. I wanted to start with this idea of the structure. Tony Gardner calls it the structure of arithmetic, or structural arithmetic. So I wanted to start with that, and then I wanted to look at how we use that to write. It's kind of to motivate writing expressions as a generalisation of numerical patterns. And then I wanted to move on to a bit more working with expressions in more depth. And we're using algebra tiles in what we're making, so linking into explaining this variable x tile, which is a new thing to them. And then I wanted to move on to substitution as like a specific instance. So if you imagine the x tile kind of varies, we can kind of fix it at a particular number and work out what the value of the expression would be there. And what happens if we then fix it at a different number? What's the value of the expression then? So that was substitution. Then I wanted to move on to solving an equation, which is where, imagine this tile is moving, and then all of a sudden we fix it there, and we know that the value of the expression is 9. That gives us our equation. Now we can work backwards and find what the value of the tile is. So it's just an introduction to algebra, very kind of informal, but I start with that overview of where I want it to go. And then I go into a bit more detail into each section and think about what do I think would be the best way to explain this? How can I link it to what the pupils already know so that it doesn't seem to just kind of poof appear out of the thin air? And then what kinds of tasks and activities will we do to focus attention in the right places?
Got it. Fantastic.
So it starts as an overview and then drills on down into each of the sections. And then as I go through, sometimes I go, oh, actually, I'm going to switch that around now. But that kind of happens as you go along.
That's great. Now, this has been a big change for me because maybe similar to you, Gemma, for many, many years I planned on a very kind of lesson-by-lesson basis. But I think, to kind of play devil's advocate a little bit, there are a few potential pros of doing it lesson by lesson. So I'm interested in your take on this. So I guess you could make the argument that maybe you could fall into the trap of being a little less responsive if you've got everything planned out. So let's say, well, what happens in this case? You do your lesson on algebra and it doesn't go quite how you anticipated it. The kids are getting the hinge questions wrong and so on and so forth. Is it then a case that after that lesson you're adapting that PowerPoint? How does that work in terms of being responsive from lesson to lesson?
So there's a couple of things there. If I stick to the ones that I'm making at the moment as an example, I am deliberately putting in places links to sets of questions. So for instance, you can generate endless questions on simplifying expressions from Johnny Hall's Mathsbot. So there's a link somewhere to these, and I know that if I need my pupils to be able to practice this a bit more, I can do that. And there's links to these kinds of things throughout. So the point when I said before that I go through the PowerPoint, that was a really bad choice of phrase there, because that's exactly not what's happening. Because what I'm doing is asking questions as I go along and then responding to them. And of course I have the benefit of lots of experience, so I know that if my pupils are stuck, I can generally figure out what to do on the fly. The reason I've made these so long is because I know that some teachers will not have that level of experience yet, so I want them to have plenty of stuff and plenty of activities there for them to do if they're not able to make it up as they go along.
That makes perfect sense.
So yeah, so I would say that I think by having it so well planned and so well structured, I'm better able to respond because I've got time to think about those things instead.
Got it. And my other question is, often lessons have kind of key features in there. So a do now would be a classic. A lot of teachers would always start their lesson either with retrieval questions with the last lesson last week or whatever it may be and so on. How does that fit into your model if you essentially don't really know or care all that much where one lesson starts and one lesson ends? How does that work?
Well, that's one of those things you then have to do as you're going along. So wherever you've got to at the end of a particular period, if your school says you must start every lesson with this kind of retrieval do now starter, you make sure that you put the relevant kinds of questions into that. It might be that you want to practice something that they just need a bit more practice on because you've identified it from hinge questions that you've used previously, or it might be something that you know is going to help with what's coming up that you just want to refresh their minds on. But that's where you have to, I think, you shouldn't be planning a long time in advance, because that's all to do with responding. And if you want it to be effective, it needs to be reactive to what's actually happening in the classroom.
I see. So there's opportunities, although you've got your kind of general overview all lined out, there's that expectation that you're going to be slotting in things as and when appropriate.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's definitely not, here is, the next 2 weeks worth of work, this is absolutely everything you will need, because that's kind of the opposite of what I want to achieve in the classroom. But what it is here's kind of the majority of what you're going to need. use this as your starting point and make it work really well for the pupils you've got in front of you.
Got it. Right. Let me put you in the shoes of a novice teacher who doesn't have Jemma Sherwood planning out this incredible outline of a lesson and so on and so forth. But they want to do this. They want to break the cycle that perhaps me and you have been in, where they're planning lesson by lesson and so on and so forth. So let's say it's a Sunday evening or whatever. They sit down. They know they've got a 2-week unit on fractions to teach or whatever. And this could be non-maths. It could be any subject. Any advice on how they start? Because it's quite overwhelming, isn't it? Thinking, oh my gosh, I've 5 lessons, 6 lessons or whatever of material. Where would a novice teacher start with this, Jemma, do you think?
So there's 2 scenarios I can think of. First of all, if you've got somebody in your department who you think you could talk to, who is more experienced and who you know would be willing to kind of get involved in such a project, definitely do it. Go and pick their brains and get their help on it. If you don't have anybody like that, I think I would probably start by working with my first lesson and then adapting to it and putting these resources together as I go along into one long thing. And at the very end of it, stop and look back and reflect and go, how well did that work? How well did the first bit work related to the second? Was there something I could have done between those lessons that would have helped that little group of pupils over there that didn't get this thing? But it's about the reflection, because with the reflection then comes the fact that you can adapt it and make it better, ready for next time. But because you've then got the initial sequence and you reflected on it, then next time you teach it, you can just iterate it and improve it a bit more.
Got it. Final question on this, Jemma, unless there's anything you want to add. It's a little bit of a bonus question, going off on a bit of a tangent here. Whilst we're talking about do-nows, where do you stand on that? If you were midway through some fluency practice or something like that and the bell went, would you start the next lesson just cracking on with that fluency practice, or do you have a definite kind of starting point to your lesson, whether it's a do-now or something else?
I think that's hugely dependent on the context in the school. So it may be that you're in a school where you need, maybe the pupils have come from PE and they've come a long way and they need something just to settle them, and you know that this kind of routine works really well because they know what's expected of them then. Great, then do it. If you know that they're just going to come and they're going to crack on with whatever you ask them to do, I don't see the need to necessarily do something like that at the start of every lesson. But I'm going to kind of totally pull back and be non-committal there and say it really does depend on context, but I don't think that they should be done like as a kind of a blanket rule at the start of every lesson.
Got it. Fantastic stuff.